Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Derek Coy, and I'm the Veterans Health Officer here at the New York State Health Foundation. I am torn between feeling very excited about this conversation because of our amazing guests, while also feeling terrible that one, the issue of military sexual harassment and assault is an issue to begin with, but then on top of that, that it's as rampant as it is. As many of you know, 8 out of 10 women report experiencing some form of sexual harassment or assault in their lifetime. And anecdotally, to be honest, I'm surprised it's actually not higher. But this is true nationwide, but it's actually a little bit more pressing in the military community as well. And there actually aren't too many folks more qualified to talk about this topic than our guest today, Haley Britsky, an incredibly talented reporter with the popular military blog Task and Purpose. Since being there for just a few years now, she's written hundreds of incredibly important pieces about myriad issues facing our military, with, by my count, at least 70 focused solely on the issue of sexual harassment and assault in the military. So we couldn't be more excited to have her join us today for this conversation. Haley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Truly our pleasure. And I want to go ahead and just dive right into the conversation, but want to let folks know that we will have time for audience Q&A. So we'd love to hear from you in about the last 10 or 15 minutes. But also, if you have any questions before then for clarity or anything else, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we'll definitely get to those as soon as we can. So I'll go ahead and get out of the way for now and jump right into the conversation. Haley, we talked about, we could approach this topic a few different ways, but I think by focusing on one incredibly important story and contextualizing it, that would really help paint a clearer picture of what these larger issues are. And there probably isn't a better case to highlight than that of Vanessa Guillen, and that's one that you've covered extensively. So can you start off by just telling us what initially was going through your mind when you were writing this piece? What were you thinking, and what was happening at that time?
Right. So do we want to start with the first, the first article about that?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, it's funny. It's something, well, it's not funny. It's just strange. Something that I've think about a lot is that first article. I think it came out, April 27th. So just a few days after she went missing. And if you look at it, it's really a very short article on our site. It just kind of includes the details from the press release that Fort Hood put out, what Vanessa looked like, what she'd left behind in the armory room, when she was last seen, and the contact information that people could reach out if they knew anything. And, at the time, I didn't think, I had no way of knowing it was going to be this story that it became. Missing soldiers or soldiers who are unaccounted for is not necessarily something that happens very rarely. We kind of see that every once in a while of soldiers who haven't been heard from. That's a whole other topic that the Army has had to address since then. But it didn't occur to me how big that story was going to become and how much time and it was going to dominate in the weeks that followed and months that followed. And so there was one thing that I think everyone kind of noticed was irregular or atypical, which was sort of the listing of things that she had left behind, right? It was her room key, her ID, her wallet, her car keys. I mean, those are not things that someone would leave if they were planning to go somewhere. And so that's really the one thing I remember thinking when we were reporting out that first story.
Yeah, similarly, I'm pretty embarrassed to admit this, but it seemed like another, oh, this is what happens. I didn't think oh, this is going to turn into what it did. It's something that does happen, to your point, far too often. And I thought, yeah, this is just going to be another one of those things that you hear about. And then just talking about timing, looking back on just, how crazy things were in general around that time. I think literally 3 days after that first piece that you wrote on her, DOD released its annual report on sexual assault in the military. What were your thoughts on that? Can you tell us what was in that original 2019 report? And at any point, did you put 2 and 2 together, or were you kind of thinking, hey, maybe there's something here, or was it still pretty, separate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things I look back on and it's like, you feel so naive, right? Because you're like, it was right. Of course there was a connection with those 2 topics, but at the time, no, I had no, wasn't connecting them at all. That 2019 report was looking at sort of how many reports of assault, and it had shown that there was an increase in 2019 of reports of assault. And, something that the DOD says a lot, they point to a lot with things like this, is that when you see an increase in reports, that's a good thing. They always say it's, that means people are more comfortable reporting. It means the reporting mechanisms we have in place are working. And while that may be true, it also means that there are that number of assaults happening, or allegedly happening. And so, it's not necessarily the good news story that I think they would like it to be perceived as. But, something in that report that I think it was a separate report that came out alongside of it, but it was sort of these interviews with service members and with people who worked in response and prevention. And the way they discuss so many topics that, we're still talking about now, we've talked about for years, which is, sexism in the ranks, women feeling that they're seen as, they have their positions because they're women, not because they're capable or because of their abilities. Assault against men being described as hazing and sort of just brushed as not as serious of a problem as it is. And it just raised so many things that I look back on now and I think, okay, we're still talking about that now, that, that was raised again and again. And the reports that came out after Vanessa Guillen's case, was we knew what had happened. But no, at the time, I had not pieced the two together at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's haunting in many ways to go back and reflect because one, you've been such a great resource, and that's why I'm so glad to have this conversation with you for myself and so many others. And I was able to kind of follow the progression of the Vanessa Guillen story, which will kind of keep as a central theme throughout this conversation, but then also seeing what came out kind of after. So, there's this 2019 DoD report, and then like almost like some kind of cruel joke, like everything is happening. You see all these folks getting charged, a lot of allegations, improper use of language, certainly sexual assault, and all this is happening. Was it pretty clear too early on, as you continued reporting on these issues, that this is just a systemic issue, that this wasn't a one-off, that these aren't things that, a few bad apples, all the examples that we give, was it pretty clear that this is a huge systemic issue?
It was, yeah. It just became clearer and clearer, like how pervasive that is and how common it is in a way that I think a lot of people don't realize. Something when I think about, because that question comes up a lot, right? Like how systemic is this problem? And I think was something I fall back on a lot. It was a moment in a Senate hearing and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Gillibrand was speaking, I believe it was to General McConville, the Army Chief of Staff, at his confirmation hearing. Must have been 2 years ago. Time has kind of just has no meaning over the last year, but I think it was 2 years ago when this happened. And she was asking him about these reports and about, sexual assault and harassment in the ranks. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, commander after commander has come in and sat here and told us there's zero tolerance for these things. There clearly is tolerance because it keeps happening. And every year people come in here and say there's zero tolerance. And every year we have these conversations. I think we saw that further illustrated in the Fort Hood Pentagon Commission's report that came out earlier this year, where they say in the report, we've heard zero tolerance. There's actually quite a lot of tolerance for these things. We saw that illustrated more in the Fort Hood report that came out last year, which showed that leaders, there was a daily battle for women at Fort Hood to kind of get through the day without being, upset or caught really derailed in their day-to-day tasks by these kind of remarks and advances from their male colleagues. And the way that leaders seem to just not see it as their responsibility. I think the Fort Hood report quoted, I think it was a senior installation commander who literally told the panel of civilians, what can I do about that? It was just kind of this idea of, well, what do you expect me to do? And so I think that feeds into this idea of how widespread this really is. And because of that, the distrust that is in so many service members that their cases will be handled appropriately, that they can trust the system to take care of them. And I think that just further exacerbates it.
Yeah, no, I think you broke that down very, very succinctly, and it is this larger issue. And I have to say this, I like the idea of calling in, not calling out, but I'll call myself out. I was in the military, it's been ages ago, but I like the idea that you can't be neutral on a moving train. And if you choose inaction during a time of something bad happening, you chose the side of the bad. And I was silent. It was very clear that sexual harassment and assault was just, pervasive in the military. but there was really no kind of concerted effort for it to change, military members' attitude or mindsets about this. It just seemed like, what do you expect? Like these are things that happen. Boys will be boys. And I don't think much has changed since then, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong. And again, I've been out of the military for quite a bit, but it did seem, like it was understood that this is just how things are. And not a lot was done, certainly when I was in, and I'm, deeply embarrassed about that. But that's something that, I reflect on and think a lot about. And I think to kind of focus back in, on the micro level with Vanessa Guillen in particular, we're in this Me Too era, post Harvey Weinstein story, and a lot of folks, and of course I think all that is great. Finally, victims are being heard, voices are being heard, people are being listened to, and we kind of look at it as like, oh, now we know, and so now we're going to try to do better and hold folks accountable. But like our Harvey Weinstein kind of story was the tailhook story in 91. For folks that don't know, I think 83 women and 7 men were sexually assaulted at a military conference in Vegas. And that was in 91. That should have been okay, hey, there's an issue here. And it seems like nothing has really happened, substantively since then. So my question to you is, what is it about the Vanessa Guillen story that was able to catch on? Because sadly, there are so many of these stories, but this one was really able to rise to national prominence. What do you think it was about this one case in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it was a culmination of several things. Like you said, we are kind of still in this Me Too era. We're kind of, we were a few months removed from the peak of it, but we were still very much in that space. I think that contributed a lot to it. You also had, a family who was refusing to take the Army's answers at face value. They were holding press conferences, they were speaking to media, they were outside Fort Hood protesting. I mean, they were really active in wanting answers about this. That also played into it. Then you had an actress, Salma Hayek, I believe, started posting about this as well. She brought a lot of national attention to that with her platforms. And then one of the biggest things that really brought up a lot of attention, and I think started getting the attention of some of the larger national media, was that hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen campaign. That was just a flood of posts on every social media platform across services, men and women. And I think it just made it incredibly hard to ignore how widespread this issue is. And how many people were saying, the intent of that was to say, I have dealt with these problems as well, and that could have been me. I mean, there was this very much there, and let me back up a little bit, because there was a little bit of confusion there. I think we still didn't know a whole lot at that point. So you had very much a narrative that was running away on its own. We knew at that point that Vanessa's family said she had reported to them she'd been sexually harassed. There was some speculation that she'd been assaulted. There were rumors going around that she was, the person who had harassed her had kidnapped her or whatever. There were a lot of theories going around about what actually had happened. But at its core, that hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen movement just really brought a lot of attention onto her disappearance. And it forced the Army's hand. It forced lawmakers to demand answers. We started hearing more and more from people who were paying attention to this. And I think it just got to the point where it couldn't be ignored. And there wasn't going to be a way out of that in which there wasn't some accountability and there weren't some answers provided.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, again, one of the great things that you were able to provide to a lot of folks were those constant updates. It wasn't a random story by different people. You could follow your writing about it and you saw how the story was developing. And I think the hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen campaign is incredibly important. And I want to get right back to that. But really quickly, when did you kind of take a step back and realize like, oh, this is gaining prominence. This is something that's gaining attention. Did you have an aha moment, or was it just, kind of the evolution of your coverage?
I think for me, it was very similar to a lot of people's, which was when we saw that story that her family said she was sexually harassed. That was in like early June, I want to say. And that I remember reading that and I just had a pit in my stomach of just like, this is about to get worse. And we're about to learn more about this, that's going to make it a bigger story. And that was the moment for me that I remember thinking, this is not just a missing soldier. This was not something that was just going to resolve itself. There was going to be more there. Wasn't sure what that was going to be yet, but that definitely was the piece that I think for a lot of people really made it stand out as a bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great example of kind of my next question, getting back to the hashtag I'm Vanessa Guillen campaign, is an amazing attendee that we have that's sharing their story. And one that's incredibly brave, and I appreciate that, and really love that folks are able to do that and let folks know that they're not alone. And a piece that you wrote in particular was kind of looking at that hashtag and using it as a platform for folks to be heard and understood and feel connected. So can you tell us about that piece that you wrote about it and what you were hearing from folks that were using it, or stories? Was there a central theme or anything that any takeaways that you got from that in particular?
Mm-hmm. I think a big part of it is what you just said, right? Which is it created sort of a sense of community, it seemed, among people who, for so long, in so many of these cases, and people I've spoken to since, there's this sense of like, you are by yourself in this, or that you can't talk about this. Don't be too loud about this. Don't be too disruptive. Kind of move on, take care of yourself, and just kind of stay quiet. And I think that this was an opportunity for so many people to sort of reject that notion of I'm not going to stay quiet. This is important, and we're going to talk about this. And then when you see how many people had that reaction, and you realize there is a huge community out there of people who have had these problems, it very much, I think, got rid of that notion that it's just one-off cases here and there. And also, I think as far as central themes, something I read a lot in those posts were leaders who didn't take action the way that they should have, leaders who sort of swept it under the rug. They were the people telling these survivors not to speak up about it, to just, sit down and stay quiet. And I think that made it a lot more difficult going forward for leaders to have this attitude of like, well, we didn't know. How were we supposed to know this was such a big deal? How were we supposed to know this was happening? You did know. So many of you did know, and you didn't do anything, or you didn't see it as the important issue that it is, or the harmful issue that it is. And so I think that was a very common theme in a lot of those posts was, showing how many people were failed by the system and let down by the people that they were told would have their backs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's so many important things in what you said. Just to kind of harp on one, I think that isolation factor, and one of our guests kind of mentioned that there's this kind of just old cliche story, because it's been used so much, that his career was on the line. He was too important. He was the golden boy, and we don't want to. We can handle this otherwise. It's just this one-off case. And I feel like that's something that's heard so many times, that we can't do anything, or what could we do, or we don't know. And it's just heartbreaking to hear that repeatedly. It wouldn't be acceptable once, but to your point, there's a national movement. There is countless research on this. So now just kind of wrap up this section real quick on kind of the story. It was weird, June 2020, remains were found. And there's, Army's putting out its investigation, its press release, and it kind of goes out of his way to say, hey, but there was no evidence of sexual assault, which seems like a pretty just unnecessary thing to say. It seems like they could have literally said anything else. We're still investigating, we're looking into it. But for them to say, hey, we're finding things out now, but definitely no sexual assault. What were your thoughts on that? And then also, you wrote kind of like the inside story. Now that we have the information, we know what it is. Can you tell us what what we know now about the story of Vanessa Guillen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think on that piece about them saying there was no sexual harassment there, the thing to know about the Army and about the military in general, which I know you know this, Derek, but it's there's this extreme risk aversion, right? You don't want to give anything away that you don't know. You don't want to opine about anything publicly that you haven't confirmed yet. And that was the question of her sexual harassment was one of the biggest questions that people had. And so when they're discussing that they're identifying the remains, they're talking, we know that the man who is accused of killing her, died by suicide as law enforcement closed in on him, which really, kind of erased any chance of closure, I think, for the family, but also of getting more answers to know what happened there, why he did what he did. And that piece about sexual harassment, I think that, they were really walking a line there and saying, well, we don't have evidence that Aaron Robinson sexually harassed her. We don't have evidence that the man we think killed her was sexually harassing her. I don't recall them ever saying, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't recall them ever saying there's no evidence that she was ever sexually harassed. Mm-hmm. They were very careful to say this man specifically, because so many people assumed that they were connected and assumed that that the man who was accused of killing her was also the one sexually harassing her. I did, like you mentioned, the sort of inside look at that case. That was easily probably one of the hardest stories I've ever had to write, but also one of the ones I thought was the most important. And I'm really grateful that I'm, a part of an organization that was able to give me that time to do that. The problem is, like, even that story, we learned more after it, right? We've been learning more, it seems like, every few months. So with that first story, we were able to look at, okay, what happened to Vanessa? We know, that she was in an army room. She was last seen on April 22nd. She was, Aaron Robinson is accused of murdering her on base, driving her off post, and with the help of his girlfriend, disposing of her body. And, but we didn't know, even that sexual harassment piece, we still didn't have that confirmed at that point. That wasn't confirmed until this year with the Army's report from General John Mike Murray. And they finally confirmed that she was sexually harassed, which is what the family had been saying for a year at that point. And they were consistently told, well, we don't have evidence of that yet. We don't have evidence, like we don't know about that yet. And they were very consistent in saying that had happened. When I spoke with them, they were that they had no doubt in their minds. And they were proven to be 100% correct when the Army's report came out saying that she was being harassed by a non-commissioned officer. It was not the same man who is accused of killing her, it was someone else. But the Army said that she had reported, I think, on two occasions being sexually harassed by this man, and that her supervisors didn't take action. They didn't report it the way they should have. They didn't handle it the way they should have. And so that was sort of the last big piece in my mind when I look at that was sort of outstanding, and that we didn't have that confirmed yet. And that was, I think, it bothered the family. I know it bothered me. I think it bothered a lot of people who'd been following this, that one piece hadn't been figured out yet. And having that report confirm that, I think, was sort of one of the last main remaining questions we had about that case.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what was so frustrating for me, is it seems like the Army and other folks were really dancing around the semantics, like, oh, it maybe, but not, she was sexually harassed, but not by the person who killed her, or, hey, we haven't found any evidence of this one thing from this one person, or similar, like you were saying, like, oh, well, reports are up, but that's a good thing because people feel comfortable. And I'm like, that's one way to put it. It just seems like they were very much defending themselves, not defending Vanessa, and that was really frustrating for me. And I appreciate you breaking down kind of what we know now and what happened as you followed the case. And I think now one of the important things I like to focus on is the aftermath that we're living in. You mentioned a few of these, but I was kind of taken aback. All of a sudden you start seeing, hey, the Army's SHARP program is going to investigate the sexual assault and harassment response and prevention program. The calls for congressional investigations, Secretary of Army, DOJ, FBI, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All these folks are really saying, hey, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Now that we have some time, what did those investigations, you mentioned a few examples, but anything else that either came from all of these investigations in particular, or some common themes, or any thoughts on having that many investigations?
Yeah. I mean, there was a moment, I think I tweeted about this last year, but it was like every week it seemed there was a new investigation being announced. And whether it was from Congress calling for a review or the Secretary of the Army saying, we're announcing this. I mean, it was really startling to see how many probes and reviews, and they never really called it an investigation until later. It was like, we're launching a probe, we're launching a review, we're like, it's like, okay, whatever. But there were so many of these, and we saw, they went until this year. I mean, and it's still happening. So much of that work is still going on behind the scenes right now. So as far as, changes that have come from that, the Army changed its missing soldier policy to make it more clear what leaders have an obligation to do when their soldier does not report for duty. There's none of this, oh, we're just going to assume that they're AWOL and assume that they'll show up eventually or we'll find them. They got rid of that assumption entirely and said, no, here's exactly the steps you're going to follow when this happens. We also know that the Army created the People First Task Force, which is still working today and, working to implement the dozens of changes that were recommended at the end of the Fort Hood report last year. So a lot of sharp redesign, that sexual assault response prevention program, and looking at how we can change things to make them work better. I mean, there were so many glaring holes in the SHARP program at Fort Hood. And there was a very widely acknowledged assumption that it wasn't just at Fort Hood this was happening. Yes, we're looking at Fort Hood, but Army leaders seem to recognize this is an Army problem. It's happening at other installations as well. So they put these things in place to try to change that program to make it essentially do what it was created to do, which is response and prevention, and in which it wasn't doing that. And so, I'm hopeful that in the, next week we have the Association of the U.S. Army's annual conference. I'm hopeful we're going to learn more about what has been happening there at that time. Something else I think we're going to learn next week is what's going on with the Criminal Investigation Command. That was another piece of the Fort Hood report, which pointed out a series of mistakes made by the investigators, the Army's own investigators at Fort Hood. They listed a number of things that needed to be changed, whether it was staffing or resourcing or, PCS moves, keeping people somewhere longer so it's not interrupting investigations, all of these kinds of things. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Army brought in its first ever civilian head of the Criminal Investigation Command. That's a really significant change. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what changes he's going to be announcing, what they're going to be working on, what changes they've already started making. So there have been multiple things that have come out of this. The frustrating part, though, and this is something that I am constantly having to remind myself because I get very frustrated not seeing things just like happening, as I'm sure a lot of people do. But a lot of these changes, we won't know if it's working for a while. I mean, there has to be some time that goes by to see, okay, what are the trends saying now? Are assaults and harassment trending down and reports are trending up, but cases are trending down, or, whatever it is that they're trying to see there. Do we feel that more investigations are being handled more thoroughly, that they're, being handled appropriately? Do soldiers have more confidence in their leaders? There are so many things that we want to see and we want to have answers on right now. And unfortunately, we're just not going to have those answers right now. We have to wait a little while. And so it's one of those things I know I and many other reporters are going to be following really closely in the months and years to come, just to be able to see or have those changes made a positive impact.
Yeah, and that's kind of like almost the only thing that matters. It's, it's great that they're doing all these investigations or whatever they want to call it, with clever titles for probes or reviews. But yeah, I think that's really, the substance and the meat of it. And I think one thing I was a little concerned because, they changed the gate name and named it after Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood. And the family said, hey, this is a great way of showing they're listening and they're responding to us. And I would not disagree with their family. As you mentioned, they were such an integral part of getting the story out there and having justice being served. So I appreciate that they felt heard. But to me, I can't help but to see it as super hypocritical that the Army says, hey, naming this reflects our values, and it's important to name this gate after her at a base named after a Confederate general. It just seems like this very conflicting issue, and all the other issues with Fort Hood in particular. It just seems like super frustrating that, I don't know, maybe that was like the one kind of, hey, we changed the name of the gate. So, I think we're on a, the right track. So I'm glad it was actually followed up with some substance. And I think kind of in similar vein with looking at accountability, there are a lot of folks that were fired from Fort Hood in particular, and other folks because of their lack of accountability or following procedure. What are your thoughts on that? Is that the same, like, is firing someone, are you really just moving them around? Is it really hurting their career? Is this something that's going to prevent this from happening again? Or what are your thoughts on that as a repercussion from completely having a leadership failure?
Yeah, so I want to go back to what you were saying about the gate, because just for a brief moment, because
Yeah.
that was a really, it was frustrating. So I went down to Fort Hood for the gate unveiling, essentially, and the family was there, and it was one of those things I think a lot of people immediately jumped on, is like, this is ridiculous, like, how dare the Army do this? And I think it was important, like what you said, the family, they thought, they appreciated that. And so I think there was, on one hand, it's like, this isn't about us as people who are observing this necessarily. It's about the family who lost a daughter and a sister. And if that brings them some, measure of closure, then they deserve that. And I'm glad that they got that. But on the other hand, no, if that's all the Army had done, if that's all Fort Hood does, then yeah, that is like a huge problem, like you were saying, because it doesn't address so many of the other things that need to be fixed and handled. And now I'm forgetting what the other question was, now that I've talked about the game.
Yeah, no, what are your thoughts on folks kind of, I say, fired in quotes, because you still have a contract, right, not like getting dishonorably discharged or any of the other things they do for, I'd say, lower ranking folks with other, like, drug offenses, for instance. They'll really make sure you're fired. But does it matter that these folks are fired? Does it really have an impact on their career? And does it do anything to help alleviate the issue of sexual harassment and assault in the military?
So I think it's a difficult question, because it is, yeah, the way the military does things, it's not like an organization where, like, you're fired, you're gone tomorrow, like, see you later. I think it was over 20 people were implicated in this. So they had some people receiving general officer memorandum reprimands, which goes into their files. They had some people being referred for disciplinary action. Others were relieved. I mean, it was like a series of things that could have happened to a lot of these people. And it does get harder when you go up the chain, right? So the 2-star commander who was at Fort Hood, the acting commander at Fort Hood during this time, I believe he was relieved, but he was moved to another assignment. They didn't just show him the door immediately when this happened. We're a little bit more unsure about what happened when you get down lower in the chain of command. All of the Army's privacy regulations and things don't really allow us to know a lot about specifics about what happened to some of these people. However, that number of people, over 20 people being implicated in this, is a pretty staggering number that you don't see very often as far as leaders being disciplined or called out for this. So I think for a lot of people, that at least sent the message that this is not going to be something that we just ignore. And I think that speaks a lot to the attention that the case got. There was, like I said earlier, there's no real way for the Army to get out of this without having that kind of accountability. I think they realized that there was going to be demands for answers and for people to answer for this. And I think they did that on some extent. I definitely think there's room for arguing on whether that was the appropriate way to go about that and what actual implications it has on those people's careers. But you don't see that number very often, and I think that's worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think to kind of, we kind of been doing like a micro, macro, in and out view of, this one particular case and larger issues. And I think one thing in particular, hopefully worth harping on and I think this is probably what I would consider one of the more important things about this conversation, is that we understand what happened to Vanessa Guillen, and we also understand that there are thousands of Vanessa Guillens out there, and there have been historically. And we look at this as, definitely an extreme example. She lost her life. It's just one of the most tragic stories I've heard in a long time, and that's saying a lot. But in addition to that, had she never been murdered, I don't think people realize how much of a toll the sexual harassment she was facing took on her. And I think you have done a really great job of contextualizing that, and especially the role that her family played. Can you tell us what they mentioned to you and what you learned about what was happening to her physically because of the sexual harassment?
Yeah, so I spoke with her younger sister, Lupe, for that first sort of deep dive into her case. And that's one of the questions that I, wanted to get an answer to. And it's something that she explained a bit. And she described Vanessa as just this very bright, joyful young woman who just had so many plans for her life. She had so many dreams and, and things she wanted to accomplish. And, she would go home, I think it was like every weekend, Lupe said, which, was like several hours of a drive. Driving anywhere in Texas it takes plenty of time. And so that just kind of showed her just total dedication to her family. And when the sexual harassment was happening, or at least when Lupe, said they assumed that that's when it was happening, Vanessa was kind of pulling into herself. She wasn't smiling as much anymore. Lupe said she would come home, and there was one instance she remembered her just sobbing the second she walked in the door. She wasn't this very like joyful, bright woman that they had known her to be. And it was just very apparent that something was wrong, which led to her mother asking her. And, her mother, of course, when Vanessa told her that she was facing some harassment, and her mother, I can't think of the exact quote now, but it was something of like, rip up your contract in front of them, like leave the army, like get out of there. And Vanessa was so intent on handling it herself. And she said, no, I'm going to handle this. It's fine. And I think what just speaks to how strong-willed she was and how dedicated she was to her army career, which just makes it, all the more devastating to know the end result of that story and what happened there.
Yeah, for sure. And I really don't think because the military is a really small percentage of the population, a lot of folks know how hard it is to be in the Air Force or to be a sailor, be a soldier. And then on top of that, to be able to perform at an adequate level while dealing with all these other things. She mentioned, oh, I'm losing my hair. She looks gaunt. She's losing weight. It's clearly taking a toll on her mentally and physically. And I think that's one of the important things to understand is that had she not been murdered, obviously that's one of the most tragic things that could happen, but she was still kind of like almost being tortured by this in her daily life. And that's what happens to a lot of folks. And when you look into it, rates of PTS are higher for folks that have been sexually assaulted. There are all kinds of trust and moral injuries that can come of it that people just don't think about. And I mean this. I think you wrote one of the most important pieces I've read in a very long time on anything, and it was focusing on eating disorders. And I think a lot of folks would maybe just be turned away from that or not put two and two together. But can you tell us a little bit more about that piece you wrote and how it ties into these themes that we're discussing today?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I mean, we talked about this before, but that I think that's, to me, has become one of the most important issues that I've gotten to work on. So just the background on that story, I was looking at the Army combat fitness test and sort of how the height and weight requirements for the Army are, kind of serving as a hurdle for some people with the fitness test, when the fitness test is emphasizing building muscle and all these things. But then the height weight test doesn't exactly allow for that. And as I spoke to experts about it, I heard multiple times, well, don't even get me started on the disordered eating problem and the eating disorders in the military. And it just became very clear to me, like, this is a really big problem. And then I started speaking to service members, and not just in the Army, but the Marine Corps as well, was a big one. And I mean, it was like the most normal thing in the world. I mean, people were just saying, oh my God, like it's something we all talk about. It's something we all do, where, I don't want to get into specific details of what happened, but, or what they were doing, but it's just very harmful practices that were seen as so normal. And so I started exploring that a little bit more, and sort of that culture in the military of eating disorders and disordered eating. And something that I heard a lot from experts was kind of how one, the Pentagon does not have a lot of data on this problem. They don't have a lot of answers, and I think that's because it's not perceived to be the widespread issue that it actually is. But because of that, so many of these organizations have had to come up with their own data. They've had to do their own research in order to show even small percentage of the issue. And something else they told me a lot of was the way in which eating disorders can manifest from things like military sexual trauma and post-traumatic stress. Those are, two very triggering events and things that can happen to someone, and how that often results in someone, adopting some of these unhealthy behaviors, and, often to feel some kind of sense of control on their life after, an event that makes them feel that they don't have a lot of control. It can manifest itself in so many ways. And I think eating disorders, experts said eating disorders is one of them. And so I think that's a really important, it's important contextually for leaders to view that, because that's also a tell of, if you notice one of your service members is, not eating a lot, or they're not really taking care of themselves, they don't look well, that could be a direct link. That could be something that you look at and say, okay, well, that person, that's new behavior for them, and they're not taking care of themselves. What could have happened to make this happen? What would have, come before them taking on these behaviors? And I think that just speaks a lot more to leaders paying a lot of attention to their service members, noticing what's happening with them, noticing, behaviors and habits that could lead to identifying something like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And again, I really appreciate you writing that. And we were able to drop the link in the chat box. So I'd love for folks to check that out. In 15 minutes, so I swear, I don't want you to run away and read it, but right after this. But I do want folks to check it out, because I think it's incredibly important. It resonated with me, someone who's dealt with this personally. And it felt like, oh, wait, like kind of like you were saying earlier, like, oh, this isn't just me. This wasn't something I experienced. It was, ubiquitous, unfortunately. And I think hopefully that's something that will help contextualize these issues. And I think similarly, you can look at a lot of the symptoms, and a lot of them tend to focus on trauma. And one of the more traumatic things anyone can experience is sexual assault, especially by someone that you are supposed to trust, or someone who's meant to protect you, and they don't. So I think looking at that just helps understand the larger issues. And we're talking about mental health more, which is great. But a lot of folks aren't understanding how a lot of these things are linked together. Like, oh, it's just, sexual harassment, which of course is heinous within itself, but that's like the stepping stone. If you experience sexual harassment, you're more likely to be sexually assaulted. If you're sexually assaulted, you have all these other mental health and physical health issues. And I think until we look at it like that, the impact of trauma and what it does to humans, all of us in different ways, I think we'll have a better understanding of what to do about it and how to accept it. And I think kind of, in similar vein, I wish we could dive a little bit more deeper into another example, I think, that highlights a lot of this, and that's of Corporal Ohu, a Marine who was sexually assaulted and then charged with an incident because of a response to the trauma she was dealing with from her sexual assault. And she's now facing a bad conduct discharge, separation. And a lot of folks aren't seeing this as clearly a mental health issue that stemmed from a violent sexual assault, and treating it as she's some kind of criminal. I know you haven't, done as deep a dive into that case, but are there similar, themes here? Is it part of this aforementioned problem, or what are your thoughts on that case in particular, and what should we be looking out for there?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I have not done as deep a dive into that, obviously, as I did with Vanessa Guillen's case. I would really point people to the Warhorse, an online news outlet, who has just done exceptional work. They do exceptional work all the time, but especially on this case. I learned so much from what I'd written in my one story about that from them. They covered that, just so expertly. But yeah, I think what you were just saying about not seeing trauma as a full picture, and all the things that can come, the way that sexual harassment can lead to assault, which can lead to post-traumatic stress, which can lead to eating disorders. It's so connected. And I think we see that really clearly in her case, in Corporal Ohu's case. The Warhorse reported out in a really detailed fashion all of the things that built up to this case, in which she was charged with, I believe, was attempted murder, and all of the times she was failed by leaders who weren't seeing what was in front of them, who weren't taking action when it was recommended. For a woman who was, there were multiple times where they reported she was seeking help herself. She was trying to get help for what she perceived, that she was in a crisis and she wasn't getting the care and support that she needed. And it culminated in this event, like you said, when she, attempted to hurt her boyfriend at the time. Even he has come out, others reported that he has said, like, he would just feel sick if she was, found guilty of these things, because he knew that it was manifested itself from trauma that she'd experienced years prior. I mean, even back to when she was a child. And so when I was covering that story and, I was trying to speak to people about some of the broader implications of that and sort of how that plays into this bigger conversation that we're having now of military justice and, command authority and things like that. And one of the things that one of the experts I spoke with was talking about was just the way in which that case made it so clear that the military does not have a good way to address trauma in a way that is helping them versus punishing them for something that's happened. I mean, identifying when someone needs help versus, like you said, treating them as a criminal for doing something that was the culmination of years of trauma that went untreated. I don't know what the answer is yet, unfortunately. And I think that's something that really needs to be a much bigger conversation about how trauma can feed into so many other problems that manifest from that. And the way the military needs to approach that, of putting care and support ahead of, bad conduct discharges, and taking away, like in Corporal Ohu's case, the mental health care that she needed, that her lawyers said she so desperately needed, and the military sort of just putting that on the back burner and saying, well, that's up to the VA now if she gets that, because we're going to move ahead with her bad conduct discharge. I mean, there's such a big conversation there that needs to be had, and I'm hopeful that we're getting into a space where that may be happening. But it is something that I think the military doesn't quite have a grasp on yet in the way that they should.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you 100%. And I think that's the tragic part. One of the more tragic parts about this is, we know it's happening. We know that folks aren't doing what they need to do about it. It's just simply unacceptable. But you touched on two things in particular, I think that helped tee up kind of like the next round of questions. And folks, again, I want to thank everyone for joining, but especially the folks that shared their stories. Really appreciate it. That's incredibly brave, and appreciate that you were able to do that. So feel free to send some questions that you may have for Haley, and we'd love to send them her way. In the meantime, the two things that you touched on, I think, one, about what's not being covered, and then two, what's happening with the Warhorse. To kind of build on that, what are some outlets or some other folks that have either been sources or outlets that you would recommend other people check out to learn more about some of these issues? And then also, what's not being covered? What do you feel like, you've been able to do this, which is incredibly important, but if there were 100 other Haleys out there and they could focus on other different topics, what else do you feel is not being covered that you would like to cover more extensively, or have others?
Yeah, God, I have a list a mile long of things. If I could just pause time and do all the work I wanted to do. Sure. I mean, as far as other news outlets and organizations, obviously the Warhorse, like I mentioned, I'd be remiss to not mention, this is our direct competitors, but Military Times and military.com. I mean, they do fantastic work. The reporters there are wonderful. Stars and Stripes. The Associated Press, their investigative team, has done a lot of work on some of these issues and issues in the military that aren't necessarily assault and harassment related, but are just as important to talk about. I would also, I mean, this is kind of lame probably, but I mean, local news, the case, Vanessa's case, was covered so much from the local standpoint, from these news organizations in Killeen who know Fort Hood, front and back, I mean, knew way more than I did, as someone who covers the Army versus just one Army installation. I think there's so much good reporting from local news organizations that are covering these installations regularly, that don't get enough credit, unfortunately. As far as, things that aren't being covered, yeah, I mean, I tell my editor we have to have a talk every once in a while, because I'm like, there's just so many things I want to do. And he's like, yeah, but you're like one person and there's only so many hours in the day. And it's something I am regularly fighting, is the concept of time. But I mean, there's so many individual stories, I think, that need to be reported. And I think that very much comes down to news organizations prioritizing them, right? You only have so much time in the day. And sometimes a lot of these harassment and assault cases can be seen as, just another case, just another, story, but they are very, like, the more they're covered, the more it's clear there's a bigger problem, and the harder it gets to ignore that. And I think that's a really important part of this. And then the other thing is, on a broader scale, is what we were just talking about with the lasting effects that assault and harassment has on someone, even after they leave service, that it's not just this event that happens and then life moves on. So often there's so many effects that come from that, that manifest itself when someone is in service, or even years after when they've left service. And so I think focusing more on that would always be helpful, just to give a fuller picture of this issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just a few questions. We'll definitely try to slow it down a little bit here. So I don't think it's surprising that the military is incredibly bad at preventing or addressing sexual harassment or assault. And then you start seeing organizations that are very military focused. So we'll say like VSOs in particular, VA, where 1 in 4 women report being sexually harassed or assaulted on a VA campus. It's not surprising that this culture, permeates other similar institutions. Do you have any knowledge or thoughts on, what could be done, let's just say in the VSO community, just coming from attendees' question, any thoughts on that, or how we can kind of take this military issue and focus it elsewhere, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's also something that I think needs to be covered more, right? Because we need better answers for that. I think I hope this answers the question, but I think obviously those issues do persist, like you were saying, like on VA campuses and things. This is true for military commanders as well, but just kind of finding that ownership, owning the problem, like whether it's on a VA campus, people who work there owning, like, this is my environment. What am I going to allow to happen here? Like, what policies do I need to put in place for people to feel as safe as possible? And I think just the broader conversation in that of, what can each one person do to address this? And in the military, a lot of that is, and the Army has been telling this to commanders and to NCOs, is, don't wait for some directive from high up to tell you what to do. If there's a way for you to address this and to make this culture better from just on your own, and in a way that you can do it today, tomorrow, the next day, then you should do that. And so I think that kind of attitude, maybe it seems a little bit optimistic or naive considering how broad the problem is, but I think there's a lot to be said for each individual person in the organization taking ownership of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And our friend Jennifer just kind of read my mind a little bit. I have two more questions, and she touched on one of them. And I think it's kind of countering the disinformation, if you will. One thing, again, that I'm not proud about, but want to put it out there just so folks know. When I was in the service, it was always like understood that there's all these false reportings, and like you could end someone's career, and like you always had to be careful, and like don't trust any woman who says that this happened, because you insert all the erroneous stereotypes. And that was always something in the back of my mind, like, I wonder if she did just say that. I wonder if it really happened. And one thing I think you did a great job in one of your other pieces. Can you speak to one, false reporting, and then two, the idea that this is a women issue? And I want to be clear. Oh, well, I'll let you explain it, but I hope I didn't, wasn't misleading. But can you speak to those two topics?
Yeah, definitely. So this is one of the. I mean, I still get hate mail about this today, but. You know how the internet is, but I mean, yeah. So that story, I covered false reports. I was down at Fort Stewart and I was talking to a sexual assault response coordinator at Fort Stewart, a sergeant first class, and I asked him about that. I was like, how big of a problem are false reports? Because it is something you hear all the time. Whenever I publish anything about assault or harassment, there's always someone commenting or emailing saying, well, how do you know that that actually happened? How do you know that they're not just making that up? And what this response coordinator told me was it's just, he's been working, I think it was like 5 or 6 years he's been working in this role. He's never once come across a false report. And he was very clearly agitated when I was asking about it, because I could tell it's something that he probably has to fight a lot, is this perception when he's talking to soldiers. It's just not, from what he was saying and from what other experts have said, statistically, it is not something that happens a lot. Will it happen once in a while? Sure, it will. I'm sure it does happen once in a blue moon, but and at the rate that people say, oh, so many of these assaults and harassments never happened, it's just not practical, and it doesn't line up with the numbers that we're seeing. And this is sort of a soapbox, but like part of that, when you're talking about these false reports, you put yourself in the mindset of someone who wants to report an assault or harassment. It's not something that's easy to do. It's not something that commands are celebrating or excited to hear. I mean, why would someone put themselves through that? It just kind of goes back to that, statistically, it's just not as big of a problem as so many people like to say that it is. And it really undermines the broader issue.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea is like, there's been very specific cases of like people being very guilty and still getting away with it. Like if you just made a claim and then someone was held accountable, I could maybe see how someone would do that. But the fact that like, if you make a claim, as we talk, most people don't take it seriously. They actually don't do anything. There's no, accountability. But again, that was something I'm embarrassed to have thought, previously. And I think it's an important thing to touch on. And I think similarly, sexual assault does happen to me. When I was talking about tailhook, even though small percentage, but out of the 90 folks sexually assaulted, 7 were men. I think it was back in 2014, but the majority of reported cases in the DoD sexual assault report were men, like 51%. But again, that's reported. There's all kinds of issues with that, and that is, now 7 years old. But it definitely is an issue that affects all genders, absolutely, just disproportionately women. So folks, just want to be clear about that as well. But if you're going to focus on who is really, again, disproportionately affected, I think that's why you predominantly do hear more cases of women being sexually assaulted. And we're running low on time. So I just want to, thank you again for joining us today and all the amazing reporting you've done and being such a resource to so many of us. How best can folks stay in touch with you? Any social media or any other way to connect, and also anything that folks can look out for that you'd like to plug moving forward, or anything while we wrap up?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you to everyone who was listening, and thank you, Derek, for having me. And I always, please email me, anyone who has, thoughts about this or thoughts about my reporting. I'm always open to hearing and enjoy hearing feedback about that. Of course, if there are stories you think are worth covering, you can find me at my email. It's Haley@taskandpurpose.com. We try to make it as easy as possible. I'm on Twitter. My DMs are open on Twitter. And yeah, I would just ask, if there's a story happening you think needs more coverage and deserves having attention, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to the rest of my team at Task and Purpose, who are all doing just as amazing work. And we're eager to cover the stories that matter. So that can only be done with people who are brave enough to come forward and talk about that.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and all the amazing work that you do. It's been so impactful for a lot of folks. And we went ahead and dropped your Twitter handle and email address in the chats. But if anyone would like to get in touch, feel free to reach out and let us know if you have any questions. Also, if you can, anyone joining, feel free to sign up for our newsletter, find out about a few more events we have coming down the pike. But thanks again, everyone. Haley, thanks again for joining. And I look forward to staying in touch with you all.
Thank you.